All right. Hello, everyone. Everyone's still awake? Can I just encourage everyone just to stand up and give the person next to them a high five? Yeah? High five. There we go. Thank you to the people in front. I know we're in that mid-afternoon slump, but I promise we'll keep it entertaining for y'all. Thank you. I see those in the back. All right. So I'm really excited about this panel or fireside chat. And it's not just because it's of my guest. I've talked a lot about culture and connection in my role as managing editor, but usually the brands you think about in culture are your Nikes of the world, your Cokes of the world, Apples of the world. But property? Alex, I have to admit, property is not a very sexy category. When I think of property, I live in an HDB. I think about all the agents leaving their handouts in my mailbox are kind of annoying. So category is usually very transactional and functional. So to kick us off, can you explain why does creativity matter in a category like property?
Cool. Thanks for having me. I'm really excited to be here. So before I jump into that question, I want to break the ice a little bit. And we bump into each other a lot in professional circles, but not a lot of people know that we went to the same high school as well. So we've got I'm a little bit older than you, but we've got our 20th reunion coming up this year. And time has been a lot kinder to you than it has to me. So
of course, all you need to do, Alex, is wear the bright shoes, yes?
So I think to answer your question, this year, we've done a lot of really kind of random left field things, as you could say. We made a reality TV show. We've made streetwear that ended up in Paris Fashion Week. We were in Vogue. And I think to answer the question of why we've done those things, it's important to set a little bit of context. So I joined PropertyGuru in 2023. It was a slightly different time. And we had a lot of competition. We were neck and neck in competition. We had fierce competitors in Singapore, Malaysia, Thailand, Vietnam, where we operate. Nearly 100% of the marketing budget that we had was being spent on performance marketing. When we occasionally did brand campaigns, it was very much what I called kind of like a 1990s telco style of creative. And then finally is that we moved incredibly slow. So when I came on board and I started looking underneath the hood to understand how we operate, this is actually not an exaggeration. We had 250 agencies and partners on our procurement system. I didn't even know that there were 250 agencies across Southeast Asia. So what was happening was that any single time we had any marketing to do, even making a single social media post, we basically would call an agency and someone would have to do it for us. So we weren't actually doing any marketing ourselves. So as I started to understand kind of where we could go, how we could better connect to the business, there were basically three things that I identified that I wanted us to focus on. The first one was incrementality. So if we fell off a bus tomorrow, how could we actually measure the true impact of the work that we were doing? The second one was on agility. How do we actually move faster, do real marketing ourselves again? And so in that case, I basically stopped any outsourcing. So we don't work with any agency partners. I said, we're forbidding it. Everything that we do now is all going to be done in-house. And then third, to the very long-winded way of answering your question, is I said that if we really wanted to build a timeless brand, we had to find a way to inject ourselves into the conversation. And the best way to do that was through culture. So I was stalking your Instagram stories. You said on a podcast the other day that pop culture, I think, is the new soft power, right? And when you look at some of the other brands who I think have been really successful in this space, look at a Stanley, right, which makes coffee cups historically for construction workers, or look at a Crocs, right? These are not the largest media spenders. These are not the most sophisticated marketers, but they've been really able to strengthen their brand and also move their bottom line performance through integrating themselves into culture. So that was something that we really were inspired by, and then we're trying to replicate today.
You mentioned that PropertyGuru was mentioned at Paris Fashion Week. Like I said earlier, not something you would normally associate with that. So how do you what gives you permission to play in that part of culture? And I'm curious how you made the case for that. Was that organic? Like, was that the plan? Was that part of your KPI?
So when things work out really well, I say that was part of the plan and the KPI. We start off by saying what's cool and what's something that we think would be fun to do. And then sort of my job as kind of the senior leader in the organization is to sell it to the CEO and the board and kind of put into some sort of business speak with ROI. But two parts to your question, right? The first one is how do we do it? And I think that the first thing really comes from humility. I don't know, I'm not a hype guy at all. I don't know anything about streetwear. I'm not stylish by any measure. I wear the same thing every single day. So I don't know anything about this entire space. So I think what happens when a brand is trying to come in, instead of coming in really hot and heavy and saying, these are the specific things that I want you to do, this is exactly how we're going to execute it, we gave a lot of autonomy to our partners in this case. So we worked with a really famous streetwear designer named Mark Ong, who's also called Mr. Sabotage. And we just said, here's the spirit of what we're trying to do. And then you translate that into your vision in a way that you think is organic and can activate your own community. So we come in with a lot of humility in that case. Similarly, when we made Home Run, our reality TV show last year, I don't know anything about making TV shows. That's not necessarily my bread and butter. But we found a really strong production partner that was able to do it. They assembled a cast, a team of people that really had experience in reality TV shows that were able to bring this vision to life. So I think having that humility and then working with really strong partners and respecting what they do as a craft is really important. The second thing is, how do you actually get it done? It's really important, I think, especially when you're moving into new spaces, when you're innovating, when you're trying things that are a little bit different than what you've done in the past, is to not go for a really big swing right off the bat. So a lot of the ventures that we have going on, these are really sort of small little tests that we do, and then we kind of get something out in the wild, and then we see if it picks up, if it has a little bit of legs, if it has some traction, then we put more money and more budget behind it. But a lot of these things just start really, really small, and then we see how the market responds to it.
It's interesting that you mentioned this kind of experimentation spirit. That is correct. And well, you gave a fun fact about me. I'm going to give a fun fact about you. So Alex actually used to work on the tech, digital media side of things, and I'm always interested to hear the perspective of people who cross the chasm, right? You know, media is such a key part in getting our ideas in front of our audiences. It's a majority of where our media spend is. And you told me actually that you've actually turned off all of your paid media. And can you, that's number one, I think, is a brave thing to do. Can you talk us through that experiment? And given the fact that you did come from a paid media background, like what has crossing the chasm taught you about building brands and vice versa? What did you have to unlearn?
Yeah, when Rupen was talking about I think he called it kind of like an axis of evil of four. So I worked at two of them for more than 12 years. So I have a little bit. I believe in climate change, by the way. So I'm not kind of on that side of the house. But exactly as you mentioned, like I'm not a brand or creative zealot by any measure. I cut my teeth in performance marketing. That's really where I sort of grew up in some ways in the marketing world. And I think one of the big benefits that I received personally from being on the platform side, both at Google as well as at Facebook, is you really get the full breadth of what marketers and brands are doing everywhere in the world. So my final remit was looking after Instagram for Asia Pacific. Every business all across Asia Pacific, large, medium, small, all verticals. And two of the things that I think really stood out to me when I finally sort of ventured out over to the brand side of the house was, one is that I think that because of how sophisticated and powerful the media buying tools have become, both at Google as well as at Facebook, is that it has given a little bit of cover in some ways for de-emphasizing the value of the creative. And so now what can happen is that anyone can make any sort of creative, whether it's good or bad, and then because you just put sufficient media behind it, you'll presume that you've made some sort of impact, whether it's on the brand or on the performance side. So I always promised myself that if I did go to the brand, I would say, let's really rely on the power of good creative, on things that can travel without necessarily having to boost it in order to get any sort of reach. And in fact, that's one of the things that I knew coming from the platform side is that the platform incentivizes brands to do good creative, right? Even if you think about it organically, when you make good creative, the algorithm wants you to stay on the platform longer, so it's trying to encourage a lot more of that type of content creation. The second thing is that I do think that coming from the platform side, I saw that a lot of people had really good ideas. A lot of brands, I said this joke that I would say, if I had $1 for every single time a brand said that they wanted to do innovation or something new or something interesting, I would have retired a long time ago. But what happens is that a lot of the really good creative ideas, they kind of die somewhere in brand bureaucracy, right? You have to get all the budgets approved, you have to do all these alignments and all of these partners that have to weigh in on it. So by the time you actually get something out the door, it's a very watered down version of what you actually really wanted to do. So there is a little bit of that element of just having courage in your idea, having courage in the innovation and the thing that you want to experiment on, and then bringing it to life. Because once you have something that's really tangible, it's a lot easier to get people on board on that train and excited about what you've done.
I'm going to stay a little bit more on this question I initially asked you, Alex, because like I said, it's a brave thing to turn off all of your media, right? How did people react? And how did you still push that through?
I just realized I didn't answer your question at all about turning off performance media. So let me make sure that I answer it this time. So as I mentioned, when I joined in 2023, nearly 100% of the budget was coming from performance marketing. And what I started to see over time, especially as we really started to emphasize our brand and organic channels, is that switch was slowly flipping. We were starting to see a lot more of our traffic coming through organic channels, like direct as well as on SEO. So in November of last year, I wanted to do an experiment, and I said, if we turned off all of our performance marketing, what would actually happen? And then you get the true sense of how strong your brand is in terms of being able to acquire users and then drive business performance. From that test, we saw that the total number of sessions that we had versus the year prior was up 2%. And we saw that the leads that we were getting for property conversions was up 3%. I thought that was misleading data, and I was like, at best I thought maybe there would be a slight dip. So I actually didn't present that to any of the senior leaders that we have at the company. We reran the test in January, and then when we did it, it was even better then. The leads were up 9%, and the sessions were up 11% versus the year prior. So I just sort of kept it off basically since November of last year. And when we look at our year-to-date performance, by all the bottom funnel metrics, we're up by about 5% year-to-date. So I think it's a really good example of how when you really strengthen your brand, focus on those organic channels, then you can actually have a little bit more of that balance, right? So I'm not saying that every single brand is going to be able to turn off performance marketing altogether, but I do think that it's worth at least asking that question of what is the baseline strength of the organic channels that we have, and then how do we then use performance marketing to augment that versus starting from a performance marketing baseline and then seeing how the organic channels perform.
I think you answered my question that time. Thank you.
Thanks.
Well, I always love it when I can speak to the converted, and I've spoken to a lot of performance marketing people who now believe in the idea of brand building, right? And media is of course a very big part of that equation, and I always like to go into the nuance, right? Because what do you think is the difference between using media to deliver advertising versus really delivering ideas, which I think ideas, a strong brand is one with a rich idea, rich values, rich brand platform. What's the nuance there that you don't think a lot of people, might overlook?
Well, I think that question I think has a couple of layers. So for example, one of the reasons why I wanted to start doing more of the work in-house was that I felt like we were outsourcing all of that creativity. So in theory, especially from the last panel, right? If marketers are supposed to be owning the consumer, owning the consumer value, especially internally at the company, if we're outsourcing all of that work, all we're really doing is program managing to some extent. So I said, we are going to be the custodians of the customer, and then we're also going to be able to tell that story externally, all done in-house. The second thing that I would say here is, again, I do think that it is worth creating a little bit of a nuance here, which is that the platforms have become so sophisticated at delivering specific outcomes. So if you say you want to get X amount of reach or you want to drive X amount of performance, then the platforms are really good at being able to do that. But I think it's worth also resetting the expectations a little bit and saying, if you as a brand are really owning the creative and the story and the inspiration of what you're trying to do and build, then you use media as the amplification tool, not the other way around. We don't start with media first and saying we're able to achieve X outcomes just because we're really sophisticated media buyers. All the media buying we do now is only if we're trying to amplify something that's already working. If it's a really good creative, then we put media behind it to make sure that it does even better than it would have.
So speaking of media, I mean, one of the key challenges that we have right now is creative fragmentation, right? I always call it like you got to create more content to feed the AI machine. And you talked about this idea of iteration and whatnot, but at some point you have to scale, right? How do you reconcile that balance to make sure you have that volume and also that consistency to build those brands across different assets?
I think there's some sort of happy medium, I think, in between where you are from kind of the traditional world where it's, one big creative idea versus the 30,000 AI videos that someone pumps out, right? The way that I look at it is it's really important to, every single time that we have a creative that gets out the door, it's a touch point with the consumer. It gives us some insight in terms of how people are responding, if this type of messaging, if this type of presentation that we put, this type of packaging is resonating with our customer. And so I think that there's somewhere in between the lines of not going for one single big bang in the kind of the traditional TV media buying world where one master idea from an executive creative director all shipped out in one go, focus grouped, all of that stuff, but not necessarily having 30,000 types of creatives, and it's almost impossible to really understand the nuance of how those are performing. So somewhere on that happy medium, I think is the right balance.
Going on this topic of kind of creative and media, and we all know, again, we live in a world where things are moving really fast, right? And I remember when preparing for this presentation, I was stalking you on LinkedIn, as we all do, and you mentioned this really interesting thing, which is kind of, everyone's familiar with MVP from the tech world, right? It's like, how do we apply that to the creative advertising world? And this idea of a minimum viable creative. Can you explain that concept to the audience here, and how does that fit into how brands should start rethinking their operating model to, really leverage the full impact of, creativity and culture and connection?
Yeah, absolutely. So to set a little bit of context, I don't really consider myself a marketer by training. So in fact, as we were preparing for this panel, Rica was saying, be honest with everyone. So I'm not really a marketer by training. I don't know anything about real estate. I don't know anything about prop tech. So theoretically, I'm kind of underqualified for the job that I have. But one of the things that I'm decently okay at is being able to pick up the nuances of how different teams and structures are working, and then figure out what actually can work for something in terms of the direction that I want to go into. So coming from a product background myself, there is this idea of the minimum viable product, right? And the idea, for those who are not familiar on the product side, is that before making and investing hundreds of millions of dollars into a whole new app or a new platform or a new technology, you validate the insight of whether this is something that your consumer or your customer would actually want. Right? And so you do that in a minimum viable way, meaning to say the most bare bones, least invested, least expensive version of the idea of what you're trying to prove out. So the way that we've done it, at least at PropertyGuru, is we have no tentpole campaigns. I have no moment. I don't know what I'm going to do in Q1 of next year. I have no big budget kind of moment where we're just going to blast a big thing into the sun. Every single thing that we do is by iteration. So we know what direction we're getting into, but we don't necessarily know how we're going to get there. What are the specific tactics that we're going to employ? So for all of the kind of the bigger things that we've done, for example, for Home Run, the reality TV show that we did last year, that was actually me working incognito as an individual contributor. I didn't even tell anyone that I was doing this. I was hiding it as a social media content idea. And I assembled a team, I put the budget together. I was working on it basically by myself for 6 months, putting everything into motion. And then it was only when we actually had the first 2 episodes that were already filmed and produced that I started to loop in a bigger team, start to kind of make a little bit more of a show about it. And then we started to see a lot more momentum out the door, that people were resonating with this, and at the same time, this is something that internally people were really excited about as well. So using that as kind of the example, basically what happens is you release it into the wild, you see how it performs. If people like it, then you amplify it even bigger. If they don't like it, then you move on to the next idea. And it's a lot more of that type of agility that we've built into the operating rhythm of our business.
All right, last question. You mentioned when you first started at the company, it moved slow, 250 agencies on the roster, and now what? You're being referenced in like Paris Fashion Week and whatnot. For anyone in the audience here, what advice can you give them to, what's the first step in becoming more agile organization in a way that builds enduring brands?
I think the most important thing that I've learned from the last couple of years that I've been on this journey is we're in a little bit of a short supply of courage. And when I say courage, what I mean is that I think a lot of people have really good ideas. Like, you walk through the door, people have really good insights of directions of cool, exciting things that they could be doing, things that can be really impactful. But again, because we've set up this system that it means that the most senior person has to align on this as a direction, and you have to have like 9 different agency partners, and the creative directors all have to go through it, and all of these layers and layers and layers. It means that you kind of default to the safest place possible, right? Because no one really wants to stick their neck out. And so what I learned, I mean, I worked on a reality TV show last year. That was not on my bingo card at the beginning of last year. But what happened was it actually had this kind of rallying effect throughout the company. And in fact, so we used to be publicly listed as a company. Now we're privately owned by a private equity company. At the board meeting yesterday, one of the private equity owners asked us how season 2 was going for Home Run. So if you ever try to sell a reality TV show to a private equity company, I mean, in my wildest dreams, I never would have thought that that was even possible, right? So I think in a lot of cases as marketers, we underestimate what's possible, what we think people will get behind. And I think having a little bit more of that courage to try those things, get it out the door, and then see what happens is kind of what I would say has been a little bit of the secret sauce in terms of how we've been able to innovate quickly.
Have courage. That's a great note to end on. Thank you so much for your time, Alex. Let's give him a round of applause.
Thanks so much.